The courtroom stood still beneath the weight of what was about to unfold. Morning sunlight streamed through narrow windows, catching motes of dust in its path and laying golden streaks across polished hardwood. It was the kind of morning that seemed almost too peaceful for the storm it would carry. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with a quiet intensity. Rows of wooden benches held a mix of spectators, some curious, others drawn by outrage, a few simply hungry for spectacle. Journalists scribbled in notebooks, their eyes darting between the players in the drama about to begin. At the center of it all, a woman sat alone at the defendant's table, her presence still but weighty, like the calm before a reckoning. Naomi Brooks looked composed, dressed in a crisp blouse and tailored slacks that gave nothing away. Her dark skin reflected the glow of the overhead lights, and her hair was pulled back with military precision. To the casual observer, she appeared ordinary, unremarkable even. But beneath the surface, something simmered. A quiet confidence, a tension tightly coiled. Across the aisle, Officer Derek Langley adjusted his uniform with the ease of practiced arrogance. His eyes swept the room, pausing only briefly on Naomi, his mouth hinting at a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He sat flanked by his colleagues, a silent wall of blue uniforms offering unspoken support. The judge entered and the room rose. A hush fell over the space as protocol set the stage. This was no longer rumor or headline. It was real. The stakes were high. A woman had been accused of assaulting a police officer. A courtroom had been called to determine truth. But truth, as it would soon be revealed, was never that simple. Not here, not today. The gavel struck once sharp, deliberate final. The hum of restless whispers gave way to silence as all eyes shifted forward. Judge Martha Ellison sat elevated at the bench, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. Years on the bench had hardened her demeanor, but even she felt the undercurrent in the room. Something about this case defied routine. Naomi Brooks remained still, hands folded gently on the table before her. Her attorney, Kevin Mason, sat beside her, shuffling papers and fidgeting with a pen in a futile attempt to steady his nerves. He was young green by courtroom standards, but driven by a fire that hadn't yet been extinguished by cynicism. Today, that fire would be tested. Across the aisle, Officer Derek Langley projected the image of assured authority. His uniform was spotless, his posture erect, his face composed. He nodded confidently to the prosecution table where Assistant District Attorney Jonathan Reed was already reviewing his opening arguments. Reed had a reputation, sharp-tongued, methodical, and relentless. For him, this case was meant to be open and shut. A disturbance, a resisting suspect, a lawful arrest gone sideways. Everything on paper told a simple story. But stories rarely lived within the boundaries of paperwork. As the proceedings began, the prosecution moved swiftly. Langley was called to the stand. His recounting of the night was calm, detailed, and rehearsed. He described Naomi as agitated, non-compliant, even aggressive. He emphasized his training, his experience, the supposed threat to his safety. Each sentence dripped with authority, designed to anchor him in credibility. The jury watched intently. Most of them leaned forward slightly, absorbing every word. To them, Langley seemed believable. His words fit a narrative they'd heard before, one that had replayed too many times in courtrooms just like this one. A lone officer, a defiant civilian, a necessary use of force. Naomi didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked on Langley, her expression giving away nothing. But inside, every word carved deeper. Not because it wounded, but because it twisted the truth into something almost unrecognizable. Kevin glanced at her, silently searching for some cue, anything to hold on to, but she remained unreadable. He knew she had more to offer than what was already on the table, and yet she had withheld. She was waiting for something. Timing, maybe, or trust. Langley finished his testimony with a practiced flair, emphasizing that Naomi had reached toward his weapon, a final stroke of danger meant to justify everything. The statement landed heavily in the room. Faces shifted, eyebrows raised. The implication echoed louder than the words themselves. With that, Langley returned to his seat, greeted by the subtle nods of fellow officers lining the back of the courtroom. A quiet show of solidarity, as if they'd already decided who the hero was. The judge signaled the defense. Kevin stood slowly, taking a steadying breath. Across the courtroom, Naomi finally exhaled emotion almost imperceptible but charged with resolve. Her time was coming, and when it did, no one in that room would be prepared for what she carried. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier now, as if every breath carried the weight of what had just been said. Officer Langley's account lingered like fog, clouding judgment, settling into the minds of those who wanted to believe authority was always righteous. But something in the silence hinted that not everyone was convinced. Kevin Mason rose slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from his jacket with deliberate calm. His posture was controlled, his expression unreadable. He didn't have the experience of his opposing counsel, but he had something else, something even the seasoned courtroom veterans couldn't ignore: sincerity. The judge motioned for him to proceed, and Kevin approached the stand with purposeful steps. This wasn't the time for drama or theatrics. He needed precision. Every move, every word had to count. Naomi Brooks stood when called, moving with the kind of control only a trained body could possess. She adjusted her blazer, walked to the witness stand, and sat with the poise of someone who knew exactly how closely she was being watched. But there was no trembling in her hands, no flicker of doubt in her eyes. As she began to recount her version of that night, the room leaned in. Her words were clear and steady, unshaken by the weight of accusation. She described standing on a sidewalk checking her phone. She remembered the beam of a flashlight in her face. She explained how the officer questioned her presence, demanded her identification without cause, and escalated the situation the moment she hesitated. Her account didn't come with the drama of Langley's version. There were no exaggerated gestures, no implied danger, just facts layered, detailed, and precise. But it wasn't just her words that shifted the room, it was the way she delivered them. She spoke not as a victim, but as a witness to injustice. Her tone never wavered, but it carried something deeper than anger, something older than rage. It carried history. The jury began to shift in their seats. Some glanced at each other. Others stared ahead, their expressions slowly changing from curiosity to discomfort. She described how Langley grabbed her arm, how his grip tightened when she questioned him, how the accusation of resistance came not from her actions but from his need to assert control. She detailed his words, sharp and demeaning, meant to cut into more than just her dignity. Then came the moment that made the room still. She told them there was no body cam footage because it had malfunctioned. The silence that followed was thick with implication, too convenient, too calculated, too familiar. The defense rested their case for the moment, and Naomi stepped down from the stand without hesitation. Her eyes never strayed toward Langley, though his eyes flickered nervously in her direction. The foundation beneath the prosecution had begun to shift, not through volume but through clarity. Not with fury, but with truth. What had started as a courtroom routine was no longer a simple question of guilt or innocence. It was becoming something much harder to contain. The courtroom was still recovering from the weight of Naomi's testimony when Kevin Mason stood again, this time with a steadiness that felt newly earned. The subtle shift in atmosphere was undeniable. What had once felt like an inevitable march toward conviction had begun to tilt under the pressure of something real doubt. Kevin reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small black USB drive. His hands moved with practiced calm as he handed it to the bailiff who approached the courtroom's media station. A hush spread through the room, the kind of silence that builds not from reverence but anticipation. Judge Ellison gave a quiet nod. The screen on the far wall flickered to life, the jittery frame of a cell phone recording coming into view. The footage wasn't cinematic. The angle was imperfect, the lighting harsh, and the audio crackled with background noise. But what it captured was undeniable. Naomi's voice rang clear, measured, non-threatening as she stood calmly on the sidewalk. Langley's voice followed, sharper, more aggressive. Then came the moment that had been contested from the beginning. There was no movement from Naomi toward the officer. No raised hand, no threat. Instead, Langley reached out, gripped her arm, and forced her against the patrol car. The words that followed struck like a thunderclap. "Women like you don't get to question me." The room shifted. A wave of energy surged through the gallery. Jurors sat straighter. Reporters dropped their pens. Even Judge Ellison leaned forward slightly, her face darkening. Langley didn't move. He remained frozen at the prosecution table, jaw, tight fingers clasped into fists. Whatever confidence he had entered the courtroom with was now cracked, if not shattered. Kevin didn't speak. He didn't need to. The footage spoke louder than any argument he could construct. It was raw. It was real. It was proof that couldn't be dismissed. Judge Ellison signaled for the video to pause. The frame froze on Langley's outstretched arm, Naomi's expression unreadable even in the grainy shot. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of what had just been witnessed was too heavy for words. The prosecution attempted to recover, claiming the video lacked context, that it didn't show the entirety of the encounter. But the damage had already been done. The jury had seen enough to plant the seeds of reasonable doubt. And more importantly, they had seen a glimpse of truth. Naomi sat still at the defense table, her posture unchanging. But something in her presence had evolved. She no longer looked like someone on trial. She looked like someone reclaiming control of the narrative. Kevin returned to his seat, his heart pounding but his face composed. He had struck the first real blow in what was now clearly more than just a case. This was about something deeper, something systemic. The cracks in the wall had appeared, and once the light breaks through, it becomes nearly impossible to stop it from flooding in. Even after the court recessed for the day, the tension clung to the walls like smoke. People shuffled out slowly, their conversations hushed and fragmented. What they had witnessed didn't just challenge the prosecution's narrative, it unsettled something deeper. Something that had long been buried under layers of assumed truths and unchecked power. Outside the courthouse, Naomi stood on the steps, her figure silhouetted against the dimming sky. The sun dipped low, painting the town in burnt orange and deep indigo. She didn't speak, didn't flinch under the stares or whispers. She simply watched the horizon, as if waiting for something only she could see. Kevin Mason caught up with her, his nerves barely concealed beneath his tailored suit. He walked with the gait of a man who had just realized how far out of his depth he really was. The courtroom battle had changed. It was no longer just about proving innocence. It was about confronting a structure that had been weaponized against the very people it claimed to protect. Back at Naomi's home, the quietness of the evening wrapped around them like a blanket. Her house was modest, tucked away on a wooded edge of town where streetlights were few and silence came easy. Inside, the furniture was minimal, but meticulous. Every object had purpose. Every space was clean but lived in. There were no distractions here, only truth, waiting in silence. On the mantel, a folded American flag sat behind glass, placed beside a photo of a younger Naomi in uniform, her arm around a man whose stern expression softened in her presence. A bookshelf held volumes on military strategy, leadership, and justice. This wasn't the home of someone looking to impress, it was the sanctuary of someone who had already seen too much. Kevin sat on the edge of the couch, his briefcase at his feet, still clutching the files from court. His eyes flicked toward the photograph, but didn't linger. Naomi returned from the other room carrying a worn leather folder. Its corners were frayed, its spine softened by time and travel. She placed it in front of him. Inside, it wasn't speculation. It wasn't theory. It was fact. Service records, commendations, mission briefs, discharge papers, letters of recognition from superiors. The contents read like the legacy of someone who had spent their life walking along the edge of the world's most dangerous places. Naomi Brooks wasn't simply a woman wrongfully accused. She was a retired Marine Corps lieutenant colonel, a special operations commander, and one of the highest decorated women in her unit's history. Kevin flipped through each page with growing disbelief. The woman who had sat quietly through accusations and courtroom theater was someone trained in leadership, negotiation, combat, and survival. She had been entrusted with lives, with missions, with the flag itself, and yet here she was fighting just to be seen. Naomi didn't explain herself. She didn't need to. The folder had already spoken volumes. What she held back in court hadn't been out of fear, but discipline. She had waited for the right moment, the one where truth could no longer be silenced by theatrics or uniformed arrogance. Kevin leaned back, the weight of the revelation sinking into him. This case was never just about resisting arrest. It was never just about a flashlight on a quiet street or a body camera gone dark. It was about the quiet war waged daily against dignity, the kind of war that didn't happen overseas, but right at home in plain sight behind badges and under robes. The next morning arrived cold and gray. A mist settled over the courthouse lawn, blurring the line between sky and earth. People gathered again, more now than the day before. Word had spread. The video had been leaked. Conversations filled with disbelief and anger simmered outside the stone steps, journalists jostling for position, while police presence subtly increased. Inside, Naomi returned to her seat at the defense table, this time with a subtle shift in her presence. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't defiance, it was command. She no longer blended into the courtroom. She anchored it. When Judge Ellison entered, her eyes lingered briefly on Naomi. Something in her demeanor suggested she, too, had heard the whispers. The bench remained neutral, but the tension had taken on a new shape, one that came with the scent of change. As proceedings resumed, Kevin stood and introduced new evidence. Not physical, not video, but identity. With measured steps, he revealed Naomi's full background to the court, not to shock, not to manipulate, but to reframe. This wasn't a woman unfamiliar with high-pressure decisions or discipline under stress. This was a decorated military officer, a leader, a protector, someone who had trained to remain composed under fire, both literal and political. The jury sat in stunned silence, eyes wide and fixed. The prosecution remained seated, their expressions slowly unraveling as truth marched across the courtroom in polished boots and unshakable calm. Officer Langley shifted uncomfortably, his face beginning to pale under the lights. His posture, once proud and straight, now sagged under the gravity of what was unfolding. The accusations he had made, the story he had told, the image he tried to construct, they were collapsing brick by brick. Kevin didn't embellish. He didn't raise his voice. He let the facts speak. Naomi Brooks had commanded teams in the most volatile regions of the world. She had made decisions where one mistake meant death. She had worn her country's uniform longer than most people in that courtroom had held a job. And yet it took a cell phone video and a hidden file folder for anyone to see her clearly. Naomi took the stand one final time that morning. She didn't speak like someone trying to defend themselves. She spoke like someone reclaiming their name from the jaws of a machine that had nearly swallowed it. Her words, delivered with calm authority, peeled back the layers of the night in question. She broke down each moment, not just what happened, but why it mattered. She spoke about being questioned for standing still, about being treated as a threat because she didn't flinch, about being reminded that for people like her, existing without permission could still be framed as resistance. And she didn't stop there. She spoke for the ones who didn't have video evidence, the ones who weren't decorated officers, the ones who couldn't walk into a courtroom with a folder full of medals and still be believed. By the time she stepped down, the courtroom had changed. Not in architecture, but in temperature, in weight, in truth. Officer Langley sat hollow-eyed, his hands trembling just beneath the table. The mask of authority no longer fit. The badge on his chest had lost its shine. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Everyone had seen enough. And for the first time since it all began, the silence felt like justice taking its first breath. The courthouse stood like a monument carved from stone, stoic and unmoved by the changing tides within its chambers. But inside, the air no longer felt still. It buzzed with expectation of consequences of reckoning. The gallery filled early. Cameras were kept outside, but their presence pulsed just beyond the walls, feeding a narrative that had outgrown the courtroom itself. Naomi Brooks walked through the courthouse doors before dawn, her posture unchanged, her pace steady. She wore a navy blue blazer tailored to precision, and her military bearing radiated with every step. There was no spectacle in her presence. It was quiet authority earned rather than assumed. Kevin Mason followed close behind, gripping his briefcase tighter than he needed to. His face carried the kind of tension that came not from fear, but from gravity. The kind of tension that only came when the truth was finally ready to be heard and there would be no turning back. Judge Ellison took her seat at the bench, her robe flowing slightly as she settled in. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the sound of the gavel striking wood felt subdued, as if everyone knew this day would not play out like the ones before it. The prosecution moved first, their tone sharper, more defensive. They stood on ceremony, attempting to reframe the narrative that had begun slipping from their grasp. Officer Langley was called back to the stand. This time, his steps lacked confidence. His uniform still fit, but the authority in it had faded. His voice trembled beneath layers of practiced phrases no longer insulated from doubt. He maintained his version of events, the same one already fractured by video and testimony, but each sentence felt thinner, more strained. He referenced his training, the need to act swiftly, the supposed threat Naomi posed. But the courtroom no longer swallowed his words as truth. They hung in the air, heavy and unconvincing. Kevin rose calm and deliberate. His cross-examination didn't seek to destroy it, simply peeled back the facade. With each question, Langley's narrative unraveled. The missing footage, the lack of physical evidence, the absence of fingerprints, the consistency of Naomi's behavior contrasted with the inconsistency of his report. And then came the final blow, the pattern of complaints in his personnel file. Not isolated, not imaginary, just ignored. The jury watched, eyes narrowed, their pens still. Some crossed their arms. Others leaned back, their faces unreadable. But the shift was evident. They no longer viewed Langley as a protector of the law. He had become something else, something harder to justify. By mid-morning, the defense called Naomi to the stand once more. Her presence was unchanged, but the room received her differently now. They didn't see a defendant. They saw a figure forged in places most people couldn't imagine. Someone who had worn the flag with both pride and pain. Someone who had endured more in silence than most had ever spoken aloud. She recounted the night again, not out of necessity, but clarity. Every detail aligned with the evidence. Her words were calm, not rehearsed, firm, not forced. She described restraint without reason, accusations without merit, and the suffocating weight of being presumed guilty before a word had been spoken. But Naomi didn't dwell in her own defense. She widened the lens. She spoke of systems, of patterns, of what it meant to be told that your presence was a provocation. Her story wasn't singular, it was structural. Her truth didn't belong to her alone. It belonged to too many who never made it to a courtroom. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She told the truth and let it stand on its own. By the time she stepped down, the room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. The silence she left behind was louder than any verdict could ever be. The judge called for closing arguments. The prosecutor stood again, shoulders squared, but his voice had lost its edge. He tried to redirect the jury's focus toward order, toward duty, toward the assumption that law enforcement must be trusted. He asked them to see complexity where there had been simplicity, to see mistakes instead of misconduct. But his argument, though carefully constructed, rang hollow. Then Kevin stood, his jacket crisp, his hands still. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't need to. His strength came from the weight of everything that had already been laid bare. He walked the jury through Naomi's character not from the lens of patriotism but of humanity. He reminded them that badges are not shields from accountability, that truth isn't a luxury granted to the powerful, that the very foundation of justice rests not on deference but courage. He reminded them that Naomi had not only defended herself, but had defended a system that had failed her, hoping it could still be redeemed. When he finished, he didn't look at the jury for assurance. He looked at Naomi. She nodded once. The judge gave instructions, his voice steady but heavy with finality. Then the jury was dismissed. Hours passed. The courthouse emptied except for a few lingering reporters and silent officers guarding the exits. Naomi and Kevin waited in the hall. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Outside, the town stirred with tension. Social media had already dubbed it the trial that shook the shield. People argued over details, over narratives, over what justice should look like when it was stripped of uniform and bias. When the jury returned, the courtroom refilled like lungs after drowning. Naomi stood. Kevin stood beside her. Across the room, Langley sat motionless, hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The jury forewoman stood, a paper held delicately in her hands. Her eyes scanned the room once before turning to the judge. The verdict was read aloud. The words cut through the silence with surgical precision. Naomi Brooks not guilty on all charges. A breath released across the room. A rush of air emotion, disbelief. Not celebration, something quieter, something closer to restoration. Then came the recommendation, formal, firm, and unanimous. An investigation into Officer Langley's conduct. The courtroom pulsed again, not in chaos but clarity. Judge Ellison accepted the verdict and the recommendation with a nod. There were no speeches, no final gavel slam, just truth standing upright in the form of a woman who never once raised her voice to be heard. Naomi left the courtroom the way she entered, steady, silent, composed. But the weight she carried had shifted. It no longer belonged to her alone. Outside, the sky was no longer gray. Let me know when you're ready for part 7. The aftermath and Legic. The courtroom had settled into a silence that felt almost sacred. There were no more questions, no more cross-examinations, no more exhibits to be admitted. Only one voice remained to be heard, and when Naomi Brooks stepped forward, the entire room seemed to pause. She stood at the front, hands gently resting on the wooden railing. Her gaze steady as it moved from juror to juror, not demanding their attention but receiving it all the same. Her presence filled the space not by volume or performance, but by the quiet weight of everything she had carried up to that moment. Her final words were not framed as defense. They were not framed as retaliation. They were the culmination of truth revealed, of silence broken, of a system confronted with its own reflection. She spoke not of her rank, not of her medals or service, but of the simple act of being present in a place where she had every right to be, and how even that was seen as defiance. She spoke of the feeling of being reduced to a threat, a stereotype, a problem to be contained. She recalled that moment of cold steel against her wrists, not with rage, but with clarity. Because it wasn't new. It was only recorded this time. She reminded them that justice wasn't a favor to be granted, but a right to be upheld. That her story was not extraordinary because of her military record, but because it mirrored so many others whose names would never fill a courtroom, whose truths would never be seen through the lens of a camera or unfold before a jury. There was no trembling in her voice, no bitterness, just resolve. A kind of strength that didn't need to be shouted to be felt. She stood not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a citizen demanding truth. When she finished, she didn't linger. She stepped back, allowing her silence to speak where her words had ended. The courtroom remained still, the echo of her presence lingering in the air, not just as a rebuttal to accusation, but as a statement of dignity reclaimed. The gavel struck for the final time, but the silence that followed felt less like closure and more like the quiet before a new kind of reckoning. The courtroom was full, yet still its collective breath held by the weight of what was to come. Naomi Brooks stood with her hands folded in front of her posture unshaken, her gaze fixed ahead. Kevin Mason stood beside her motionless, the tension in his frame taut but composed. Across the room, Officer Derek Langley sat stiffly, his expression vacant, eyes glassy with the fragile veneer of someone who had run out of defenses. The jury forewoman rose, a slip of paper in her hand, and began to read. The words landed with the precision of a blade. Naomi Brooks not guilty on all charges. The oxygen returned to the room in a collective exhale. A wave of energy moved through the gallery, an undercurrent of relief, disbelief, and for some, justice delayed but not denied. It was not a moment of triumph, but of vindication. Then came the second blow, the jury's formal recommendation for an investigation into Officer Langley's conduct. The language was sharp, unequivocal, and unanimous. It was more than a suggestion. It was a call for accountability. Judge Ellison acknowledged the verdict and the recommendation with solemn authority. Her face bore no reaction, but her eyes lingered briefly on Naomi as if recognizing that something had shifted beyond legal procedure. Outside the courtroom, the world was already reacting. News crews surrounded the building, their cameras waiting for a glimpse, a statement, a headline. Crowds gathered at the courthouse steps, some with signs, some with tears, many with nothing more than the need to witness a moment they could carry forward. Naomi exited without spectacle. Her steps were quiet, deliberate, unshaken by the noise around her. She stood before the cameras, not to celebrate, but to speak not for herself alone, but for the countless unnamed faces who had never reached a courtroom, who had never been believed, who had never been heard. She spoke of dignity, of due process, of what it meant to wear the uniform of her country and still be seen as less than equal. Her words didn't demand justice, they defined it. She made it clear that this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a conversation long overdue. In the months that followed, the consequences unfolded swiftly. Langley was placed on administrative leave, then formally dismissed from the police force after an internal investigation confirmed repeated violations of protocol and misconduct. A criminal inquiry followed, revealing additional instances of excessive force and fabricated reports. The shield he had hidden behind for years no longer offered protection. The department faced mounting public pressure. Community leaders demanded reforms. Policies were reevaluated. Body cam regulations were tightened. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened. What had begun as one case became a catalyst for a broader push toward transparency. Naomi didn't return to anonymity. Her name began to appear on conference banners, on community panels, on documentary credits. But she didn't seek recognition. She simply showed up with the same calm authority that had carried her through the trial. She spoke not to inflame, but to inform. Not to accuse, but to empower. Her story inspired others to step forward. Complaints once ignored were reopened. Cases long dismissed were re-examined. People began to believe that justice, though slow, could still find its way. Kevin Mason found himself in demand not as a legal prodigy, but as a man who had listened, who had trusted a client others had underestimated. He took on new cases with a deeper sense of purpose, less about winning, more about seeing people. And Naomi, though no longer in uniform, continued to serve. She traveled, she spoke, she listened. But most of all, she reminded those who would hear her that silence was not always consent, that strength did not always roar, and that sometimes the most powerful resistance was simply standing firm in the face of injustice. Her battle had ended in a courtroom, but her legacy had only just begun.